Everyone avoided that cabin. Nobody could say why with any clean certainty, only that people steered their wagons a hair's breadth wider, that children scared each other with its name, that even the dogs would stop at the high grass and refuse to cross the rutted track that led to its step. It sat a little crooked on its knoll, one corner bowed like a man suddenly tired at the seams. The sun was a coin fallen behind the plane when Caleb Stone saw the silhouette of a woman hammering against its sagging roof, and for the first time in years, he did not turn his horse toward the farther road. "Tell me where you're watching from," because the wind that rode the plains that night seemed to carry everything the people in town refused to say aloud: grief, rumor, and a kind of sharp, small courage. Caleb rode slow, as if the earth under the mare might break if he quickened. He had the look of a man who had taught himself to live with less, fewer words, fewer ties, fewer reasons to go back. Mountain years had carved him into something spare and practical. His coat was weathered down to the elbows, his boots picked clean of mud from 1,000 ridgelines. There was a wooden box strapped under the saddle, the wood a dull, familiar thing. Sarah's box, he still thought of it that way, though it had not left his trunk in 10 years. Inside were a few letters, a copper coin with a notch, and a small leather-bound journal with Sarah's careful hand in it. He kept his past like a tool, useful to the feel and weight of living if kept within reach. The cabin made a little sound as the woman struck the hammer down, and dust went up in a soft cloud. She moved as if the work was not new to her, although the nails bit into the bent tin with a stubborn resistance that drew dark lines down her palms. The sun hit the edge of the tin and turned it to a thin, angry flame. He could see the set of her jaw, the way she tucked hair behind her ear with the same hand that held the hammer. There was something stubborn in that posture that matched the plane, a refusal to bow to the wind. When he stopped and hailed, the woman did not leap as some might at the sudden appearance of a man on a horse. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving freckles of rust and sap, and squinted up at him with an appraisal that was not unfriendly and not unafraid either. Her name was Emma Crawford, she said, and there was grit in the syllables that sounded like a promise. She had come back, she said, after Thomas had died, to finish what Thomas had started. That alone was enough to give the cabinet its rumors. The town never liked a widow who returned to keep a house when easier hands could have taken the lot and left the small trouble of its memory to the wind. Caleb noticed, before he said he would help, the way the town had already done its worst on her. The hedgerows outside the path had been trampled in places where wagons had turned away.
Henderson, from 3 miles over, had sent a sermon, thin and cold, through a neighbor about how a woman ought not to meddle with men's work. The name Benjamin Hartwell had been mentioned too, in whispers and in the trading post corners. Well-dressed, with a penchant for deeds and other people's fields. It was the sort of thing people said in low voices, and then pretended not to have said at all. They worked in the dying light, 2 figures beneath a roof that threatened to slide itself away. Caleb handed nails, and brace after brace, his fingers remembering the rhythm of hammer on wood. The hammer became a language between them, one that said, without words, that things could be held together for another day. Emma had the kind of hands that showed where the work sat in a life, callous as that drew lines of story, thin scars like punctuation marks. She spoke in small sentences about Thomas, about the ledger in town, about how the roof had given when the last storm came. She would not leave. She would not sell. She simply wanted what Thomas had left, and what she and he had planned when they were young and still thinking the world would be kind. Caleb told her his name, and little of what had been his. He could have told her everything, about Sarah's laugh that had smelled of coffee and pine, about the cold in his chest after she was gone, but he held some things for himself the way a man holds a winter coat against a draft. When she reached for a nail, fingers trembling, he slid a tin cup across the sill, and she drank with a kind of thanks that did not need proclamation. The cup left the rime of coffee on her lip. The wooden box he set by his knee, the leather strap creaking. Inside the journal lay, with its neat spare entries, like a map of a life. Once, when a gust snapped the loosened eave, his hand reached for the box as if to anchor something. He did not speak of anchors, not yet. Night came with honest sound, wings of wind, the low groan of oak, the tin above their heads rattling like a small, stubborn bell. They hauled beams into place, drove posts against ruts, and when the worst chop of the storm hit, there was a moment when neither of them spoke. The cabin shuddered. The rain found every old fault. A gust lifted the tarp and nearly took it. Caleb braced his shoulder against the doorframe and felt older hands reach for the same timber. It was in that small, tethering touch, palm to palm on the joist, fingers locking with the mechanical intimacy born of toil, that some of the thin frost between them thawed. They lasted the storm with the sort of noise that made sleep a thing of sudden permission afterwards, the quiet converse of exhausted bodies, the small victory of a kettle singing, the shared tin cups growing warm in their hands. By the stove the light was a small pool, and Emma sat with a small leather book open on her knees.
It was Thomas's ledger more than a diary. Accounts and small notations, a list of neighbors owed and debts clear. But margin lines held sentences about crops, about rain, about a bench that Thomas had planned to make. He had written in the ledger's breath the kind of ordinary love that is a list of needs met. Emma traced the ink with her finger, the way someone might read a hymn. "You look like you keep things," she said to Caleb, half question, half acknowledgement. He answered that he'd kept enough to keep by. He did not say he had kept too much of what once was. Instead, he asked, because it is the most solid of questions on the plains, "You have kin in town?" Her face stiffened the briefest moment. "No kin to speak of. I had neighbors before Thomas, people who looked after their own. It's different now." They slept on bundles of hay, backs to a rough-hewn table, ears open to the rain until dawn bled into a thin, clear morning. When they rose, the world had been scrubbed clean. The roof held. The horizon lay long and pale. It was the coffee and the scrape of a spoon that brought Hartwell's name over the ridge, the way a bad smell meets an open window. Margaret at the trading post had seen him, she said, and she had watched him step down from a carriage with boots that did not need the plains to look at them. He had left a card in the ledger of the town that read like a claim. Hartwell's letterhead carried a seal that glittered, and the kind of inked assurance that made people feel as though law itself had been pressed into the paper. They rode into town the same day, Caleb on his mare, Emma following at a quick stride with her apron gathered. The trading post smelled of tobacco, lamp oil, and flour. Margaret stood behind the counter with sleeves rolled up to the elbow, a face that had seen more than its share of trouble, and still could set a kettle to boil as if the world would answer this simple courtesy. She waved them in as if she had been waiting. "Benjamin Hartwell was here," Margaret said plain. "He's been buying up claims and corners. Says he's got the Crawford place proper now, deed and all." Hartwell himself did not come to the trading post with the swagger one might expect. He had the smoother approach, like a man who sold insurance rather than teeth. When he met Emma, there was a polite turn of his mouth, and a business card pressed into her hand. His suit was clean enough to have been ironed by someone whose hands never had to face a storm. He spoke in well-shaped sentences about titles and interests, and the benefits of leaving to men of capital who knew how to see projects through. He sounded in his manner as if community were a ledger where every line balanced in favor of the man with the heaviest pen. Emma's knuckles whitened on the card. "This is a mistake," she said. Hartwell smiled like business had taught him how to be gentle. "Mrs. Crawford, the law doesn't care for intention. It cares for ink." "There's a deed here that shows." He slid a paper across the counter. The ink was dark and decisive. At the bottom, a signature curled like someone who had practiced his lines on a page until they looked just so. The paper bore the weight of someone who had anticipated resistance. Maggie's hands trembled when she set it down. The ledger of Thomas had a smear of Thomas's own ink in the margins. There was no such smear on Hartwell's copy. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath, and then some sharp woman at a nearby table tutted small and said the sort of thing people say when they do not want to watch trouble. "You'll need a judge," Caleb said. His voice was flat and even, the kind of even kept by men who had seen too much and kept the edges of their talk clean. "You'll need more than that," Hartwell said. "I've given a notice, 3 days. After that, my men will see to the removal." 3 days. The number felt like a nail driven into the plank of the world. Emma folded into herself for a moment, then straightened. She had no money to fight lawyers. She had hands and a ledger and stubbornness. If the law could be bent by ink and coin, she had the stubbornness to force it to bend back. Caleb's martial years were a thing remembered like a scar, a quick attention to detail, a town sense for wrongs, a habit of writing things down in a ledger of his own that belonged to a time when his name had still meant a badge. He could ride to the territorial capital. He could petition a judge. In his mind, the steps were clear and, perversely, simple. He would go, he would ask for a hearing, he would press for a review of the deed. He did not pretend it would be quick. He did not pretend the judge would be favorable, but he had a practical faith that law existed to be a slow, steady remedy to greed.
Emma's eyes met his. "You will go?" He nodded, the same way you nod to weather. "I will ride for the capital. A judge might take a look. I'll ask for a writ to stay any removal. If he's bought it fair and square, then you'll lose no more than any of us might. If he's forged papers, he'll answer for that in court." She crossed her arms, suddenly small and enormous at once, like someone folding in to make room for a body not yet there. "I can't have my house taken." "You won't," Caleb said. There was a weight to that promise he meant to earn rather than merely state. He felt the old stick of duty pulse under the skin, a thing that had been bone deep once, and that had only been rusting in the years since Sarah died. It sharpened when confronted with the sight of a woman with a ledger, a hammer, and the plain refusal to give. The town, small as it was, constricted in gossip and sympathy. Mrs. Henderson objected openly at the market, then lowered her voice to something less absolute when Caleb's look stopped her.
A few men offered to stand with Emma at the cabin until the judge's writ came, but none of them had much appetite for facing Hartwell's hired men. Margaret brought out biscuits and listened to Hartwell's lawyer whispering promises of compensation that tasted like coal. The trading post held the smell of trouble and coffee. For a while, the town sat between the two scents, deciding which to breathe. Before he rode, Caleb kept to the edge of town. He took out the wooden box and turned it over in his hands. He opened it and did not take out the letters. He pressed his thumb along Sarah's looped handwriting and let the weight of memory sit a moment. The smell of pine and coffee again, a laugh that came with the first thaw. He had been walking away from that life for years, thinking it safer to be alone with the mountains and their cold certainties. Standing with Emma beside the cabin had been small at first. Now it felt like a return to something he had left foolishly behind. The box clicked shut with an almost polite sound. "I'll go tomorrow at first light," he told Emma. She nodded, as if a plan, once made, might make things right. That night, the town watched them leave in the way people watch a slow fire. Hartwell did not make a show of his satisfaction. He left town with his suit unsoiled, a polite letter tucked into his coat. There were men in his employ, though, the kind who had spent more of their time learning how to take than to ask. Jack Morrison's name came up at the saloon, a man with marks that read of fights and interrupted sentences, and a face that was too familiar with other people's fear. He was the sort of presence you did not want on your porch when dawn came with the wrong sort of purpose. Caleb saddled before dawn. The mare's breath was white in the cool air. The plain lay open and empty, water silver and infused with the same quiet that followed a storm. He rode with nothing but the wooden box and a small pack. The judge in the territorial capital was a man whose name carried the weight of ink. A petition to him could become a temporary stay. A signature could give Caleb authority to serve a writ and bring Hartwell's men before a court rather than the town yard. The law would be slow, but it would be lawful, and there was a dignity to that which Caleb had learned to value when Sarah was alive, and when he had believed that men could be bound by oaths and written words. As he rode, he saw the markers of the land, the river's braid, the broken fence that once had been more useful than it was now, and each memory of Sarah unspooled like a match struck, and left a trail. There was the winter when the roof caved and she had sewn patches in the canvas to keep the cold out. There was the neat scrawl in the ledger where she had penciled in a promise to plant beans along the east row come spring. The ride was long enough for these things to come and go like weather, and Caleb's jaw tightened each time a memory rose. He had learned to steel himself against grief by living outward, by filling the days with work so that evenings were less loud. Now the work was different, a ride for a writ, a return to towns and judges and men who wrote on paper. Back at the cabin, Emma did not idle. She nailed and braced and argued quietly with the wind and with the idea of surrender. She gathered witnesses in the way of a woman who had learned to be careful. Old Ruth from the next homestead, who remembered lending Thomas a scythe. Silas, who had kept account in the town ledger and could testify that Thomas had settled his taxes. Mrs. Henderson, though prickly, had once been seen furnishing Thomas with seed. Emma moved among these people with a steadier courage than the ones who preach will ever know, collecting small affirmations like pebbles in a pocket. She wrote a statement into the ledger, detailed and plain, about where she had been when Thomas died and what agreements had been made. She kept the ledger with the careful reverence of one who hoards the truth against the day it will be needed. The second morning after Caleb left, a rider came in, not quite belonging to Hartwell as a man, but belonging to that sort of command. The rider brought a paper with an imprint and a seal, and a tone that made Emma's hands go cool. Hartwell's men were active. They had not come to the cabin yet, but they had placed the letter on the post outside,
an official notice of removal with a time set. The paper told no stories of kindness. It told of process. It gave Emma 3 days. Emma read it and set it down as if something had burned her palms. Then she marched back to the house and took the hammer. She banged nails into beams like someone driving fate back into place. She barred a shutter. She took the ledger into her hands and wrote names of those who had known Thomas. She called on the Trading Post ledger keeper and recorded the debt owed by Hartwell in a small scrawled hand that only later would bear the weight of law. The town's voice, when it spoke, was a mix of pity and quiet cunning. Some felt for her and offered help. Most kept the distance a town keeps when it is uncertain of its own security. Hartwell's shadow over the town was a thing that made people careful with their loyalties. Money could do that. But there was also a nucleus of community that would not merely step aside while a widow's toil was taken as some accountant's tidy profit. Margaret pinned a note on the Trading Post wall, a list of names willing to testify to the reality of the Crawfords' claim. It was not much, but it was a beginning. 3 days caught in the clock like an organist holding a single, impossibly long note. Each spoke and moved as if time itself had narrowed to that number. Caleb rode with speed, urging horse through rippled prairie, the sun a ball of heat, rising and falling and rising again. He clocked his progress in mile markers and in the tired blink of his own eyes.
Townspeople called his name as he passed, a shouted blessing or a look of wonder, depending on what they had decided his life had been. He did not answer them with much beyond a nod. The job required movement, not conversation. Along the way, he considered his authority. He would petition the territorial judge, but he could, on proper showing, request temporary deputization to serve writs. The law in the territory allowed for provisional powers when the writ could not practically wait. He would show the ledger, he would show Emma's receipts, and he would ask for a writ to prevent any removal until the judge had examined the deed. The chain of authority, if properly handled, would put Hartwell into a court rather than out on the road with hired men. But law is water that must be guided by a channel, and channels clog. Caleb thought of Hartwell's signature and of the neat inked scroll at the bottom of that forged deed. He thought of Jack Morrison, who was said to have a temper and a willingness to make things simple with his fists. Violence might yet be a thing the town had to face, but Caleb kept taut the thought of a court, of a judge's signature, of a warrant that could be served with respect rather than force. He had no intention of stepping outside the law unless there were no other options. For a man who had once carried a badge, the law had been a cloak and a purpose. He wanted now to wear it again. He rode until the Capitol's lights were small pinpricks on the horizon, until he could see the courthouse, squat and stone and serious, and knew he had entered the place where ink becomes something more than paper. He found a clerk and told his story with the practical exactness of a man who has been taught to leave nothing to memory alone. The clerk's face was neutral, moving with the slowness of city bureaucracy, and yet the presence of a judge's chamber meant a certain kind of hope could be lodged on the page. A writ could be issued, a judge could review. When Caleb asked for temporary authority to serve a stay, the clerk held his pen over the ledger and then paused. "You served before?" the clerk asked. "Once," Caleb admitted. He had been a marshal in a time when badges were simpler and the mountains closer, long enough to know how to do it. The clerk tipped his head. "Then take this stamp and go see Judge Marcus Morrison. He's stern but fair. He's a man who doesn't much like men who take by force, even if they dress their taking in pretty ink." Marcus Morrison's name was a sort of comfort, a man whose career had been to hear and measure and mark down what could be proved. He had a reputation for giving the law its due and for being partial to the town that kept its own. When Caleb waited outside the judge's door, he kept his hands on the wooden box and thought of Sarah and of the way duty in him had once been like a fire he was proud to feed. Inside the judge's chambers, the furniture smelled of lemon oil and old paper. The judge, a man with a clean beard and eyes that measured rather than judged in the common sense, did not waste time. Caleb told the story. Hartwell, forged deed, 3-day notice, the ledger with Thomas's ink in the margin, Emma's name, and the witnesses waiting in a town that did not have much appetite for open conflict. The judge read the petition with the slow, attentive interest of a man who knew that cloth and ink could be the difference between stealing someone's home and preserving an honest life. "If you can show probable cause that the deed is forged," the judge said, "I will issue a stay of removal until evidence can be presented before the court. I will sign a warrant to allow you to serve it. But understand, Mr. Stone, that the law is not a blade to be wielded out of season. You will be given limited authority. Use it to bring men before a court, not to become a court yourself." Caleb felt the weight and the relief of the judge's words.
It would not be quick, it would not be a neat ending, but it would be lawful. It would be a different thing from the street justice that unforgiving men often prefer. He folded the papers and felt the ink like a small victory. When he rode back toward the cabin, the world had a different edge to it. He carried a warrant and a temporary authority that would allow him to serve the writ, to command Hartwell's men into custody if they refused lawful process. It was not a pistol in hand so much as a piece of paper that might stop fists. It was a thing of civility and of a judge's signature, and it satisfied Caleb in the way a clean, honest task does. He arrived with the late sun behind him like a promise. Emma met him on the porch, eyes washed with wear, but bright with the kind of fierce gratitude that does not have a simple shape. She took the papers as if they were a talisman and read them carefully. The judge's name, clear ink, the clerk's stamp. The paper gave her a breath she had not known she needed. She hugged them to her chest like a child clutching a blanket. "Now what?" she asked. "That depends on Hartwell," Caleb said. "If he's honest, he's entitled to his day in court. If he's not, then he'll have to answer. Either way, the law will have a say before anyone is hauled off." She leaned her forehead against the edge of the door for a second, as if to press all her small fears against a cold surface. "I don't want to see Jack Morrison on my porch," she said quietly. "No one does," Caleb said. "That's part of why I came." For a night, the two of them sat and went over the ledger, the witnesses, the names of those who might speak. They made lists in pencil on a scrap of ledger paper that Emma kept folded in her apron. They pinned Ruth's name and Silas's and Margaret's. They considered what the proof of forgery would look like. Ink different from the town's usual hand, the lack of Thomas's discreet scrawl, payments recorded that did not match the ledger.
Small things, but they were the sorts of things that made a judge nod and a jury lean forward. The next morning, the pasture smelled of wet grass and of the wide-open future, at least as far as a future weighed in planks and roofs could be. Caleb prepared to ride again, not to the capital, but to call witnesses and to make sure the town had its courage arranged where it needed to be. He tightened the leather on his saddle and strapped the wooden box, Sarah's box, underneath, because he did not like to leave it unattended. There was a comfort in its weight, like a familiar tool he had not used for a while but intended to keep. Emma offered him a tin cup and filled it with coffee. She pressed it into his palm with dirt still under its rim. "Come back," she said. He thumbed the rim and the metal clinked. The cup was light but honest. He had been a man who could ride away and not look back. He had chosen, slowly and without apparent drama, to look again. The decision sat in his chest like a seed waiting for warm rain. "I will come back," he said. It was not a promise of forever, only of a return at a needed hour. There was work to be done and a process to be followed. For now, that steadied him. He rode out with the flat of the plain before him and the sky a long, unfinished page. The town watched him leave and felt itself a little more ordered for the presence of law on a ridged path. At the cabin, Emma closed the door and pressed a hand to the ledger on the table. The hammer waited in its familiar place. She walked along the wall and checked bolts and braces, then set the wooden box Thomas had kept by the hearth in a safer place, lifting it as if the wood held the shape of someone gone but not erased. Out on the road, Caleb rode with a focused pace. The warrant in his saddlebag felt like a bridge thrown across a river. Behind him, the town made its own small arrangements. Names called, witnesses coaxed, the saloon keeper keeping a cautious eye on the road for the sorts of men who came in with boots that knew the language of threats. Hartwell did not yet show his hand in force. He moved instead through the paper and the slow grind of promises and accounts. As the sun threw long shadows and the plain lengthened into evening, Caleb let his mind carry the small things. Sarah's scarf folded in the box, the tin cup on Emma's porch, the ledger open like a palm. There was a knot in his chest he could not name. It might have been fear, it might have been something like hope. He had left the mountains in part because they let him become a man with no need to lay down roots. Now the notion of fixing a place again, however hazard-laced, had a strange pull. He did not know what he would find when he returned. A court could be slow, Hartwell could be patient or reckless, Jack Morganson might be waiting with a temper sharpened by too many drinks. Yet as the mare carried him forward, it was not only law that steered him.
The sight of a woman, hammer in hand, staying to save a house laid against the plain, had opened something in him that was not ready to turn away. The wooden box under his strap thumped once against his knee with every stride, a metronome of past and future meeting. By the time the stars went sharp and the capital's lamplight wavered, the worth of small acts felt different to him. A loan of a hammer, a shared tin cup, a witness called to speak truth. He had started the ride as a man with his past folded neat and private, and he arrived at the courthouse with the past turned outward, a reason to stand and to ask the law to do what law must do. The case, if it could be called that yet, had a shape, a forged deed, a widow's stubbornness, a man of ink who preferred the clink of coin to the weight of a neighbor's name. The next steps were not yet in his hands.
A judge would sign, witnesses would be sworn, and a town would show whether it could hold to its better self. For now, Caleb sat on the courthouse steps and watched the horizon cut a clean, possible line. He opened the wooden box and ran a finger over Sarah's handwriting. It steadied him like a simple prayer. At the cabin, Emma stoked the last of her coals and set the ledger open under the watchful light. She sharpened the pencil and wrote the names again, careful as anything. She listened for hooves on the road and for a man's silhouette that might bring lawful paper or menace. She kept the hammer by the stove and the tin cup clean, and when the wind picked up, she braced the shutters like a woman fastening the teeth of a good blade. There was a moment, as night slid toward the small hours, when Emma walked to the window and watched the plain. She lifted the ledger to her breast and felt, blunt but true, the vulnerability and the stubbornness that kept her awake. The town had not yet decided whether they would stand with her. Hartwell had not yet shown his true hand. Everything contracted to a thin, bright focus. 3 days, a judge's signature, a ride that had been undertaken in the name of right. And somewhere beyond the circle of lamplight, Jack Morrison was thinking of a porch that might be empty soon. The sound on the ridge came first like a loose thing, the clink of metal on metal and the soft, organized tread of boots. Emma stood with a short board across the doorway and the ledger under her arm, as if paper could be a shield. The tin cup was clean on the sill where she had set it after Caleb left. Its rim caught the light and looked like a small promise. She had spent the day sending out those promises, names pinned on Margaret's wall, Ruth's neighborly oath, Silas's ledger notations, small evidence for a world that preferred to count things on paper. Each name made the room closer and the risk more communal. When the shadows lengthened and the sound of hooves rose on the road, the names pressed into her hand like stones.
They came in a tidy line at first, 2 men on horses and a wagon with a driver who kept his face turned to the road. One of the riders dismounted with the comfortable arrogance of a hired hand and stepped up the path. He was broad-shouldered and wore a face made taut by patience and practice in making people feel small. Behind him, the wagon's door swung, and Hartwell's suit, cleaner than the plain, glinted even at a distance. The man who stepped forward, Jack Morrison, spoke polite, low words as a way of making the afternoon seem ordinary. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, lifting the brim of his hat slightly, as if he were tipping an invoice. "Mr. Hartwell sends his regards. He says you'll find this easier if you leave without resistance." Emma kept the ledger tight. She had insult and pity in town enough. She did not intend to take either from a hired hand. "There's a writ on the way," she said, steady as the kind of metal that refuses to bend. "If there's been some mistake, it'll be made right. If not," she let the sentence hang in the air like a nail waiting for a hammer. Jack laughed, a dry sound. "Mistake's a generous word. Mr. Hartwell has papers, Mrs. Crawford. Pretty signatures. Your stubbornness is admirable, don't get me wrong. Most women are sensible. Most leave when the ledger says so." He gave a small jerk of his chin toward the wagon, where a folded paper lay, waiting for the courtesy of a hand to slide it forward. Emma shifted so the hammer was against her hip, visible enough that it might be read as a tool first and a threat second. She had no desire to make trouble. She had desire only to keep the work that Thomas had left. "You can take letters from a post," she said, "but ink doesn't make truth." "That's convenient," Jack said, and a smile that did not reach his eyes showed teeth that knew how to scare a woman into leaving her home. Behind him, the other rider idled, fingers wearing a length of rope like a man thinking of how ropes are used. Emma's voice was a thin cord around a steel beam. "We've got witnesses. We've got Thomas's ledger. We'll let the law decide. I'll give you rope for your wagon, but you'll not put a man on my porch to pull me out." Jack's mouth tightened. He moved nearer, on the inside of the board that served as a door. "You can make a lot of trouble for a little house, ma'am. Mr. Hartwell pays men for trouble." He let the threat fall as casually as coin placed on a counter. From the lee of the low hedge, Ruth stepped forward, hands trembling but face firm. Silas stood behind, holding his ledger like a shield. Margaret's apron was dusted with flour, but her posture was one of someone who had worked harder than she had ever intended. Even Mrs. Henderson had come at the last, her face set under a bonnet that had never known a storm it could not name. Ruth's voice was rough, but it was the kind of voice born of afternoons spent seeing the small rights of people undone.
"You step on her porch, you step on all of us," she said. "Thomas paid his taxes. He worked. He didn't make a fool of anyone. We know him." Jack's lips moved in a slow consideration, like a man counting something invisible. The air between them was taut enough to cut. He circled once, testing. "You could save yourselves a whole lot of trouble," he said. "Mr. Hartwell will be here. There's no law for stubbornness." And his fingers found the ledger's spine and felt the thin knock of Thomas's pencil lines. She had brought that little book to the window and read it as if each line might change fate. The hammer in her hand was steady. The small leather-bound journal she had later placed on the table was open to a page where Thomas had noted a date and the planting of beans. Nothing dramatic, only the day-to-day commitments that make up a life. That was the evidence she had, a life in tiny, stubborn lines. For a long moment, Jack considered the group and then shifted his weight. He stepped back to the road and signaled. The men remounted. The wagon creaked. They left with a muttered threat and a promise that Hartwell would be back. The sound of boots faded across the plain. For a small, dark while, everyone stood in the place between relief and fear. Emma let out the breath she had held and set the ledger on the table. Her hands trembled, but she did not show it outwardly. "They'll come back," she said. "They always come back." They did. The next noon, Hartwell arrived in person, the kind of man whose polish had been made to intimidate instead of persuade. He walked up the path with the air of a man who had recited every argument in the mirror and found them agreeable. Jack lingered near the wagon like a hound that expects to be given its command. Hartwell's first words were precise and mild, the sort of voice meant to be recorded in depositions and make judges feel pampered. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, placing a gloved hand on the ledger briefly as if inspecting a fruit. "I regret any trouble this may cause you. Business is business. The law is clear." Emma's chin did not rise. "The law is not a glove," she said, "and business does not make right." Hartwell's lips drew. "There are processes. I acquired this property through lawful means. The papers were signed by an agent of, or at least, by an instrument executed in such a manner that I cannot be expected to read the handwriting of everyone who has ever possessed these lands." He produced another copy of the deed and set it on the ledger. The ink lay dark and decisive. Emma's candlelight eyes traced the lines. For a moment, Hartwell's smile was a small, polished thing that could be wiped away if the world were not so willing to take a man's words for coin. "You will leave," Hartwell said. "If you do not, you force my men to make the removal. That will be regrettable for everyone." Emma met his gaze. "I have witnesses," she said simply, "and a life in the ledger he kept. You may have ink."
"I have truth." "You overrate honesty," Hartwell said. "You underrate circumstances. The court will decide, but in the meantime you must understand that time is a thing I do not wish to waste." He left under the pretense of patience and comfort, but his eyes promised a return that would be less civilized. The town's whispering spiked with anxiety. Hartwell's words had a way of sitting in the air like scent and making windows close inward. Caleb's return had been a small shadow at the end of the day. He rode like a man who had been given a task and took it with the simple gravity of someone placing a tool in a hand. His papers were stamped by the clerk. The judge's ink was a small gold line that meant he could act to serve a stay of removal and arrest those who resisted the law in open fashion. He had not promised to be a hero. He had promised to follow the path of law back to its resting place. When he rounded the low rise and saw the men still standing, his jaw tightened. Emma met him with a look that was both exhausted and steady, as if the ledger itself had become a pulse. Caleb dismounted with the slow courtesy of a man who knows the cost of hasty movement. He set the wooden box beside the step and let the old weight of Sarah's memory click against him. It steadied him like a prayer. "I've got a warrant," he said, showing the paper upturned like a blade softened by ink. The judge's name was clear. The clerk's stamp shone. "It stays removal until the court hears evidence. You are to desist and to allow the law to take its course." Hartwell laughed, a sound pitched like a coin dropped into water. "A pretty piece of paper," he sneered. "Who made you, Mr. Stone, the town's conscience? I pay men for work. I pay for results." Caleb's hand was loose at his side, not on a pistol, but near a manner that had long practiced restraint. His voice was a flat edge. "I made myself the place for the law to start. That paper bears a judge's hand. I suggest you obey it." Hartwell smiled, thinned, and he motioned. "Jack, take her." Jack advanced, the muscle memory of menace in his shoulders. Rope was looped at his hip. A hand reached for Emma's ledger in the same greedy casualness a thief uses to test a purse's seam. Caleb did not draw his weapon at once. He stepped forward and presented the warrant full before Hartwell's men as if it were the sun that could not be looked away from. "You will give that ledger back," he said. "You will stand down." Jack's gloved hand touched the leather, and the hammer at Emma's hip caught his eye. He grabbed suddenly, careless in the hope that force would make it all simple. Emma snapped back like a work-hardened thing and pulled the ledger. Jack's grip tightened, and for a breath it was a struggle of hands over paper, two knuckles meeting a truth neither cared for. Caleb called out, steady and sharp, "By order of the territorial judge, I command you to release that property and withdraw to the road."
"You are under lawful notice to be detained if you resist."
Jack snarled and drew a knife, but the move was clumsy and reckless, the sort of sudden swing men make when they have nothing left to lose and think force will tip the scales. Caleb moved as he had in years gone by, but without the relish that sometimes colors violence. He fired a single warning shot into the ground at Jack's feet, more to startle than to harm, but Jack kept coming, blade arcing. In the scramble, Jack misstepped. A second shot grazed flesh, not a killing bullet, but one that took substantial purchase, through shoulder muscle, and sent him staggering, roaring. He went down behind a barrel, hands blood slick, the knife clattering out of reach. The wagon horses skittered. Hartwell's face went white in a way polished suits do not often allow. Caleb did not celebrate. He moved to the wounded man and from the back of his saddle took a folded piece of linen and bound the wound as gently as he could. It was the only violence left that still kept measure. He signaled for Ruth and Silas to help secure the men. Hartwell, who had never been armed himself, tried to make a scene, to throw accusations and speak of illegitimacy, but the judge's stamp on Caleb's paper still hovered between them, like a law that could be enforced. "You should not have come yourself," Hartwell hissed, as if his pride mattered to the morning. "You should not have thought you could buy what you did not own," Caleb said. "The law will sort it." Jack was taken into custody by the men Caleb had rallied in town, quiet, sober people with the sort of courage that arrives when a neighbor insists on being endangered for the common good. Hartwell protested loudly, but had no pistol to pull, only a carriage and the court's indifference. He signed papers through his lawyer's hand promising compliance, but the paper tasted like stale air in the mouths of those who had watched too many promises fail. They transported the man to the courthouse under the solemn eyes of a town that had been too slow to learn its own courage. Jack's wound was bound and he was set on the bench with a blanket. Hartwell was escorted in handcuffs for the charge of unlawful eviction, and more importantly, for the trial that would follow: forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. Caleb watched them go and felt a wash of something like relief and a tremor of doubt. They were not all his to bear, and yet he had borne enough. The legal wheels turned, and they turned in the kind of patient, grinding way that both comforts and frustrates those who have seen a wrong done. Judge Marcus Morrison convened a hearing. The courtroom smelled of lemon oil and old paper, and in a way, of justice in the slow sense of that word. Hartwell's lawyer, a man whose face had trained to look like calm, argued procedural niceties. He had a knack for turning dates into ambiguities and signatures into matters of taste. Emma sat in the front row of the ledger on her lap.
Margaret and Ruth and Silas sat behind her, and a handful of townfolk leaned forward as one might lean into a gathering storm, ready to declare where their loyalty lay. The judge listened with the cool patience of someone who had seen too many men try to buy a verdict with coin and charm. Caleb testified with the economy of a man who knew what mattered. He described the ink differences, the ledger's margin with Thomas's scrawl. He described Hartwell's pattern of buying small claims and creating a paper trail where none had been. Silas brought forth his ledger entries, the tax receipts, the dates that matched Thomas's handwriting. Ruth testified to the scythe she'd lent, to the times Thomas had come to help her fence, to his payments and his work. Margaret spoke with a practical clarity born of years behind a counter. Hartwell came in and left a card, she said. He bought small claims that could be made tidy, but he left them tidy by ink, not by force. The room hummed with the energy that comes when small facts are laid side by side and make a shape the law recognizes. Hartwell's lawyer tried to rebut each fact, raising technical points, objecting to small witness recollections, asserting rights of ownership. Hartwell himself tried to charm the court, to play the gentleman who had been misunderstood. He had a voice and a practiced humility. He failed to convince because the ledger had teeth and witnesses had weight. At a key point, Caleb produced the wooden box and set Sarah's journal on the table. It was not evidence in the legal sense, but it was evidence of a man who had once carried a duty. He read from a line Sarah had written years ago, the sentence spare and certain, about the faith one owes a neighbor. It was small and sentimental, and yet it had the power of something true. The judge's steady gaze softened for a moment. It was not the law speaking, but it was the human. The prosecution called an expert of a sort, Silas's own eye. In a time before formal forensic handwriting experts came to rule, a clerk or neighbor who had seen a man sign a ledger 100 times was often the best witness. Silas pointed out differences with the quiet precision of a man who had kept accounts his whole life. A curl here, a pause there, the unfinished dot that had been Thomas's mark, but had been left out on Hartwell's deed. It was not spectacular proof, but it was enough to make the judge nod. When the judge read his verdict on the matter of the writ and the stay, it was as if a weight had been shifted. Hartwell's claim was suspended pending full proof. He would answer charges of forging the deed.
The court ordered an immediate inventory of Hartwell's holdings to ensure restitution could be made if the charge is held, and it bound him to the town until the trial could be convened. Jack's wound would be part of the record. His violence would be judged alongside any coerced removals. That many in town had feared the law might be a slow, toothless thing.
Yet here, in the slow hands of ink and witness, the law caught. Hartwell's satisfaction soured as he understood that ink could be unmasked by paper and people together. He had counted himself clever. He had not counted on neighbors talking, on ledgers listing, on a judge who knew the sound of a town's life. The trial was formal, but not long. In the small way the world has of making certain men answer, Hartwell's that work began to fray. Men he had hired for small jobs, tempted by pay, found their consciences tugged or their pockets empty. One of Hartwell's own clerks, an unassuming man named Peters, who had arranged papers in Hartwell's office, came forward under oath and produced a set of receipts showing payments and the means by which the deeds had been drafted. His hands shook as he testified, but the shape of truth was there on the table. Drafts, copies, a hand that had been trained to imitate others. Jack, meanwhile, sustained a shoulder wound that left him sallow and careful. He muttered when called to the stand, trying to fool the court with rough bravado. Under the judge's patient questions and Caleb's measured cross-examination, he stuttered into admissions that Hartwell had offered money for quick removals, that forgery had been suggested and sometimes facilitated, that the wagon and the men were used to make people give up before the paper went to court. There was no glory in the confession. The court recorded it with the same pragmatic attention it gave to receipts and signatures. Evidence piled, receipts that didn't match ledger notations, a sequence of forged signatures with 2 smooth loops, testimony from a clerk who admitted to being pressured into creating copies, and the ledger that lay open on Emma's lap, showing the life that the deed tried to erase. Hartwell's lawyer tried to spin every angle, but the threads came together slower than Hartwell liked, and more gently than those who prefer violence might wish. The judge found Hartwell guilty on counts of forgery and conspiracy to dispossess the widow. It was a punishment that fit the crime in the practical way that mattered to the town. He was fined, his assets were ordered to secure restitution, and he was remanded to custody for a time proportionate to his offense. Jack was convicted of assault and resisting lawful authority, and given a sentence that would keep him away from the plane for years. It was not vengeance. It was law doing its work with a measurement to set things right rather than escalate wrongs. Outside the courthouse, the sense of relief was not the wild joy of a quick revenge. It was the quiet settling of something that had been pulled away from a family and placed back. Emma's hands shook as the official deed was filed, her name recorded in the territorial office, the judge's hand a seal that turned rumor into reality. The wooden box was tucked under her arm as if it were a relic of the fight itself.
Caleb watched the papers be recorded and felt an old, slow satisfaction, like a man who had mended a fence and watched the cattle stay in the right field. Hartwell went to a small stone cell with the same composure he had worn in town. His face had the pallor of a man who had never imagined to meet consequences that filed their teeth into his neat plans. The town's restitution was not perfect. Legal remedies seldom fix everything. But the judge's order created a process whereby Hartwell's seized assets would be used to compensate those he had ruined. For the widows who had other small losses, the funds would not erase pain, but would make possible a winter without hunger, a repair to a roof, a seed ordered without fear. Rebuilding was not something that happened in proclamation. It happened in mornings and in the thin ritual of pounding nails and aligning beams. The cabin grew planks and then shingles, and the hammer became a repeated motif of healing. Emma kept a steady hand at the work even when her fingers burned. Caleb learned how to accept help without making it a transaction. He learned the intimacy of labor as a kind of speech. They found in the rhythm of shared tasks a vocabulary that needed little else: the passing of a nail, the tucking of a board, the steadying of a post. Neighbors turned up with spare lumber and with food, offering labor in amounts their conscience allowed. Margaret brought bread that smelled of butter and yeast. Ruth came with a pot of stew and the steady assurance that some debts are owed in neighborliness and not in coin. Mrs. Henderson, who had been sharp and busy earlier, brought a small sack of seeds, and after a long moment, a short, clipped apology. Her voice had been worn thin, and Emma accepted the words the way one accepts a necessary tool. She did not relish them, but she received them. There was a particular afternoon when the wooden box came out again, the box Caleb had kept strapped under his saddle. He had not meant for it to become the center of anything. It was his private thing,
remembered like a relic of an old way of being. But now it seemed right to make one small, honest right. They dug a shallow hole by the hearth where Thomas's work had been most apparent and where a new foundation would be laid. Caleb opened the box and took out the copper coin with its notch and the letters folded in Sarah's neat hand. His fingers were careful. He did not speak at first. The wind made small music in the trees. Emma watched as he set the letters gently into the soil, and then the coin, and then a small scrap of Thomas's gardening note folded tight and placed there as well. It was not an erasure of grief. It was acknowledgement that the past had been held and would be honored without allowing it to dominate the future. "You bury things and you keep things," Emma said softly. She had a hammer in one hand and a small brush in the other. Her voice had the compact strength of someone who had survived hard weather.
"I bury debts and keep the ledger. You bury your letters and keep the box." Caleb looked at her, and the expression on his face held something like forgiveness toward himself and toward the world for the fact that he had let grief keep him away so long. "I keep it so I remember the right way to carry things," he said, "not as a burden, but as proof that things can be kept with care." They filled the hole together and covered the small relics with soil. It was a private, modest ceremony. No fanfare, no overwrought speeches. A small marker of stone they set in the earth, a quiet punctuation. Winter came with its sharp lines. The cabin, new in parts and repaired with care, kept out the worst of it. They worked on a lean-to for supplies and a small addition to shelter an extra room that might, someday, be more than that, a place for another life to be formed. The tin cup still sang against the rim at dawn. The hammer hung near the door like a promise made real. Caleb did not run when the plane called. He rode sometimes. There were reasons to leave, but he returned now with a purpose threaded through the days. He sat with Emma on the porch in evenings where the sun rinsed the land in gold, and they talked in the way of people who understand the small economies of living: what to sew, where to mend, when to visit the trading post for coffee and newspapers of a sort. Their conversations were often about nothing of consequence, and therefore much of consequence. They argued about the direction of the ridge fence and the best way to cure salt pork. They read the ledger together and counted the eggs in a quiet ritual. The town changed slowly. People who had skirted the cabin's track felt less taut walking past. Children who had been warned off the place for reasons they never understood began to include it in games that had nothing to do with rumors. The cabin, once avoided as if it were a fault line, became a place of steady work and daily noise. The change had less to do with courtroom records than with the weary, patient way people attach themselves to a neighbor who refuses to be priced out. There were awkward moments. Not all apologies were sincere at first. Hartwell's assets paid some debts and not others. Some people felt justice had been only partial. The judge's orders had the careful balance of law, sufficient but not perfect. They left a residue of things that could not be fixed by money alone. Years lost, trust frayed, reputations nicked. But Emma's deed had been recorded, and the ledger's small marks were now official. That was substantial enough to allow planning. One of the small, sweet victories came in spring when a cart rolled up with a parcel of plants, beans and a few seeds, that Ruth had managed to borrow from a cousin. Emma and Caleb planted them side by side, their fingers in the same row of earth, and the action felt like a reclaiming of a small portion of what Thomas had planned and what Sarah had once tended.
Caleb's nights were less lonely, not because the past had been solved, but because he had chosen to let the present be company. He kept Sarah's journal now on a shelf near the stove, its spine facing out, like an open invitation. Sometimes, when the wind argued with the roof, he would take it down and read the small, precise sentences about coffee and a winter's fire, and he would fold it closed with the same tenderness he used to tie a knot in the bridle. Emma planted a small box beside the hearth, where she kept things of use: needles, thread, the ledger's pencil. The tin cup sat on the shelf and caught sunlight in the morning. The hammer hung nearby, its handle darkened by use. The repetition of small acts, the hammer's rhythm, the tin cup's clink in the mornings, these were the stitches by which the cabin's life was rebuilt. There was a day when Caleb found himself walking the path to town not as one obliged, but as one wanted. He went to the trading post and broke bread with Margaret and listened to the saloon's low talk. He ran an errand or two for Emma,
and stayed to help fix a broken cartwheel. People still asked about the judge's ruling, as if they were curious whether law could be counted on to protect the little things. Caleb answered with the only truth he had learned in recent seasons. Law helps, but neighbors do the rest. The winter's last snow ground down into soil, and the cabin, with its new lean-to and its repaired roof, took on the look of a place meant to endure. Emma kept a light in the window at night, and sometimes Caleb would find himself walking there, simply because seeing that small lantern glowing against the dark reminded him of reasons to stay. The final legal paper, the formal recording of Emma's title, came with an evening in town when the clerk slid a stamped sheet across the counter and said, "It's done." The building around them seemed to exhale. The deed was official now. It had the weight of ink and a public record. Emma's hands were steady when she took it, and Caleb felt a swell of something close to triumph, tempered by the knowledge that lives are repaired slowly. They celebrated without show. A pot of stew was shared with Ruth and Margaret and a couple of neighbors. They clinked tin cups and laughed a little at small things. The ledger was set aside for a while. The hammer lay in its usual place. Caleb took the wooden box one evening and put it on a shelf where the sun would reach it in the afternoon. He opened the journal and ran his finger over Sarah's handwriting. He did not speak of leaving the mountains again. Instead, he spoke of returning them to small daily matters, like where to hang a coat or whether to build a new step on the porch. It was Emma who made a small proposal one morning over coffee. She had folded a page from the ledger into her hand and set it between them. "If the roof holds this winter," she said, "I'm thinking of building a small addition. A room for guests, maybe.
Or a baking hearth so I don't have to take my bread to Margaret every week." Caleb laughed, a sound that had become a little more frequent. "I can help with the beams," he said, "and I'll promise not to let any man take your house." She looked at him then, with a clarity that made the space between them feel like measured light. "I don't want a rescuer," she said. "I want a partner, someone who knows how to mend a roof, who knows how to call a judge, who will feed the hens of a morning when I sleep late." He reached for the tin cup and tapped the rim, the sound small and cheerful. "I can do that," he said. "I can stay to hammer boards and to keep a watch. I can be present while you make bread and make plans." They did not speak vows, but they made a series of small promises: to tend the land together, to keep the ledger updated, to plant the beans Thomas had once dreamed of. They made those promises in the way people in that world do, by putting their hands to work and their names on papers, and by building a roof that sheltered more than bodies. Years later, the cabin looked little like a structure to be feared. Children ran past it with a frankness that had been absent before Hartwell's shadow. People left their sleighs nearby without lowering their voices when they passed the gate. The porch was a place of talk, and the leaning post bore the marks of hands that had belonged to family and friends. The wooden box sat on a shelf, the lid never locked, its contents a memory and not a chain. Caleb kept his saddle and rode now for reasons of kindness as much as habit, carrying parcels and calling in favors, and sometimes riding to the capital for small matters of law when the town needed his voice. He kept Sarah's letters folded safe in the box and read them sometimes as if from a distance. He had learned the economies of grief, how to hold it without allowing it to smother new things. Emma taught Caleb how to knead properly and taught a girl from the town to mend seams without fuss. They argued about fence lines and the placement of an extra window. In winter evenings they read by the stove, the journal and the ledger in reach. The hammer hung on the peg like a friend. Once, in the slow hour when the sun slid down and the plain took on an honest blue, Caleb and Emma sat on the steps and watched the land breathe. The hammer rested across their knees like a small mutual trust. He had buried relics of a past he loved. She had kept the ledger that proved a life had been lived. Together they had turned fear and rumor into something steady. Caleb thought of the wooden box and the path that had led him back, not in great speeches, but in small acts, stopping to hand over a nail, sliding a tin cup, staying through a storm. He felt less like a man who had abandoned something, and more like a man who had come full circle to a place where work and care were the same thing. At dusk, the roof caught the last light and turned to a thin strip of gold.
Children's laughter came from down the road where they chased a hoop. A dog barked in the distance. The cabin no longer stood on a knoll to be skirted. It stood as a place of noise and mending and honest labor. Everyone had once avoided that cabin, the town would say later in the recounting of small histories. because it stood as a place where grief sat heavy, and rumor had made it a courthouse of its own. But then a widow had come back with a hammer and a ledger, and in coming back, she had broken the rules, those rules of easy retreat and polite indifference. She had refused to give up what was hers. She had forced the law to remember that ink without truth is only a shadow, and a man who had kept his past like a tool in a wooden box had chosen to stop riding away and to stand. They had rebuilt more than a roof. They had rebuilt a small community's sense that truth could be kept, and that law, when properly guided, could be a shelter. Hartwell's judgments and the arrests changed some things. The work changed others. Where rumor had once bound people in fear, the habit of showing up for one another set a new pattern. When the sun finally went down that day, and the light flattened into a broad, honest dark, Caleb and Emma stayed on the steps for a while longer. The ledger lay closed between them. The tin cup they shared steamed softly in the night air. The wooden box sat on the shelf, a quiet thing. The hammer leaned against the doorframe, worn at the handle and proud for its service. Caleb reached over and took Emma's hand, as if it were the simplest of agreements. "We'll mend the fence this week," he said. "We'll plant the beans. We'll fix the lean-to before the next storm." She smiled, a slight sure thing. "We will," she said. "And if any man comes thinking he can buy what we own, he'll find the law is kinder than he thought." They rose and shut the door against the night, the click of the latch a small punctuation. In the dark beyond the porch lantern, the plane kept its secrets, but the sound of voices and the rhythm of hammers had changed the way those secrets were told. If you liked this story of stubborn truths, small acts, and the slow work of setting wrongs right, subscribe and watch the next tale of the plains. There are more cabins and more people who refuse to be moved.